Good afternoon, everybody. This is Vivek Joshi, your host of the Aftermarket Champions podcast. I'm excited to bring to you yet another episode of our ongoing series. My guest today is Roger Durham, who is a veteran aftermarket and services leader based in Europe. I got to meet Roger a couple of years ago, and I always found our conversations fascinating and insightful. And so I thought, but naturally, it'd be good to have him as a guest on the podcast and let the others listen to what his experiences have to offer as well. With that, Roger, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
So, Roger, obviously, I know a little bit about your background. Maybe it would be great for you to tell your story to our listeners. You know, your early education, where you came from, where you worked, and what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm British. I studied engineering originally. I started with Siemens in the UK around about 2001. My background is large capital equipment like gas turbines and turbo compressors, and I spent a lot of time in the oil and gas industry, but I branched out in recent years into other industries as well. I've traveled a lot. I've been living in Germany for nearly 20 years now, so I've been living over here for quite a while.
And when you travel a lot and you lived in Germany, did a job take you to Germany?
Yes. So I was originally in the UK, and Siemens bought the company I was working for. And then as a part of the integration, I was offered a job to work within Siemens in Germany. And then I took that and have never looked back.
When you think of your career in Siemens, you said you started in the UK first and you got moved over as part of the integration. Were you in engineering, or were you in operations, or were you always in service? And if so, in aftermarket and services, how do you wind up in that role?
Good question. I honestly fell into service by accident. I studied manufacturing and I expected to go there after graduate training, but I was actually offered a job within the service division. I really enjoyed the agility, the flexibility, loved the responsibility they gave me from day one. And I also really enjoy working with customers. So I took that job and stayed there. I really enjoy it, and I've sort of developed over the time. My role now gives me responsibility for about 100 million euros of spares sales, right from customer inquiry through to delivery. So that's a really exciting place to be. And in parallel, I'm also responsible for a transformation which we're carrying out, which is to move from a reactive mode to a proactive mode with our aftermarket customers. And that's really an exciting area to be at the moment. Trying to predict customer needs using data-related insights, analysis, AI, and also doing this not just for the new machines, which you could actively remote monitor, but also the older machines. Because as you'll know, Vivek, the older machines is usually the vast majority of the fleet that are running, and where the business is coming from, and how to do something proactive with those machines and get focused campaigns and therefore growth with those machines.
You know, you said you're doing this transformation now, but clearly Siemens, you spent 20 years. Is that kind of where you developed a lot of these practices and ideas in terms of thinking through proactive service, using data? Because you work across many Siemens businesses, if I remember correctly, and Siemens always has been a leader in the field of aftermarket and services.
Correct. They're a huge company with many, many different products and entities. They invest in a lot of research and development, and they're always very much at the cutting edge of what can and what is being done today. It was really useful being able to sort of best practice share between the different divisions. So taking an idea from healthcare, for example, bringing it into smart infrastructure, where I did work for a while, as you said. Also, from example, rail into energy. Anywhere you can take a best practice idea and bring it across. And I think that's held me in good stead I've always tried to do that over the years, trying to look outside your immediate sphere of reference to look for other ideas and see what you can bring in to make things better.
You know, so you mentioned something about sharing ideas across divisions, best practices, lessons learned. Were there common themes and ideas or philosophies that you guys held in your mind, and as you did the service and aftermarket work at Siemens, what was the commonality across everybody?
I think the common theme that I've probably had going through my career is probably transformation and continuous improvement. To stay ahead of the competition in service is always a constantly moving, constantly changing field with lots of small competitors out there. So you need to be constantly developing. These could be daily changes, but as my career has progressed over time, those sort of change management programs, I guess, have got bigger over time. But generally, those programs, be it large or small, were a starting point with some sort of a sales focus, customer focus, finding a way to bring that into the business with an optimization, some sort of business process or digitalization or whatever tool needed to achieve that customer need. And then a human change aspect as well. If you want to make things stick for long term, then you need to make sure you do the human change aspect as well to make it stick. Otherwise, as soon as you walk away, then it's going to go back to the way it was before.
It's interesting you said what you just did, because one of the things I've always told our customers and prospects is that, and again, I'm just speaking in a very parochial manner as a technology provider now, you have to have a good balance between people, process, and technology as part of the transformation. And any one of those legs of the stool is off, especially the people aspect. Just the stuff doesn't work. Right?
Absolutely.
It's just painful.
Absolutely. I'll add a fourth leg to that stool, if I may, which is data, quality of data, which is something where I am with my current role is a very pertinent question at the moment. That the quality of the data is very, very important. But you're absolutely right. Without all of them together, they all need to work in. They all need to work in tandem.
They need to work in tandem. But what I find very often, and this is, again, you've been around services for 20 plus years. What I find, Roger, is that unfortunately, the industry that we've been in, and I've been a manufacturing capital equipment guy like you have for a long time, the industry has been so starved of investment for ages that it's going to take a while to get out of that mess, right? So the transformation you talk about cannot be like a 1 year long thing. It's going to be a multi-year transformation process. What are your observations, or does that make sense of what I just said?
Absolutely. It's a really good observation, actually. Really good observation. It's one of those questions that how do you change some of these real fundamental things without the budget or the strategic support or some of these other big top level supports in the background to enable you to do it. There's two pieces to that, I think. One is there needs to be some certain baseline platforms, the foundational changes. But I think also within service is more exactly as you alluded to. It's more about a marathon rather than a sprint. It's not about an individual big project to get out the door. It's about lots of small individual daily transactions happening. And I think if you can approach it from that perspective, from a continuous improvement perspective, and each one is 1% better every day, and each of the employees is doing 1% better every day, adding all those 1% up can have a huge overall impact and a cumulative impact far bigger than any one individual project might. So I sort of keep myself happy with that in mind, but I totally agree that there needs to be some big projects, occasionally some foundational ones, in order to enable things.
It's fascinating you mentioned the 1% improvement idea, right? So it's been, I won't say well talked about in the press, but certainly the 1% rule is a great idea that a lot of people follow. What I find interesting is, in the world that you and I live in, which is quote unquote services, life cycle services for capital equipment, the life cycles of these relationships can span decades, right? So you sell a machine and it sits in the field, in the factory, in the building, and wherever for 15, 20 years. And we have 15, 20 years of opportunity to do the 1% all the time. Life cycle.
Absolutely.
Are there people who are thinking in those regards? I mean, clearly what the 1% is actually is something I'm going to use. I'm going to borrow shamelessly from you, by the way. But to me, it's a fascinating thing, right? Because one of my customers had said to me, Vivek, sales does the first event, we do the rest. right?
Yes.
Which is
Yeah.
the same thing, which is life cycle. And then we do the rest. We have a chance at 1% every day for the next 20 years, or 1% every interaction for the next 20 years. Who in your mind, who in your observation, Roger, is thinking about it that way or is doing it well? Or maybe that's an interesting paradigm to set up here.
It's a very interesting paradigm, very interesting question. I think there are some out there, and I think that's where the top players in the field and the sort of key account management type relationships with some of between top players and top customers, where those sort of conversations can happen. I've seen them happening at those levels where once you've got all of the day-to-day stuff out of the way and resolved, and I say that as a caveat, that needs to be out of the way first. If that's not out of the way, you will never be able to get to those long-term conversations. But once those are out of the way, then you can start having those longer-term conversations at more senior levels. But, and you mentioned it quite nicely in one of your previous podcasts I was listening to recently. You were talking about the process maturity and service maturity. And you made an interesting point there that there are sort of steps 1 to 4, if you like, or various different steps. And to be competitive, you need to be 1 step ahead of the market, but you can't be 2 or 3. And you can't bypass stages and try and jump straight to stage 4 or stage 5 or whatever. You need to go through each stage in turn. And I think that's the same paradigm we're talking about here. If you're having those sort of long-term discussions with the customers, it's almost pointless trying to have a stage 5 type discussion with a customer if one of their major machines is sitting downstairs broken and not working and we haven't got any solution for him. The conversation will be around that. Only once you've solved that can you then go into the longer term conversations.
Yeah, and I think I call that basic hygiene, right? If you don't take care of business that you have in front of you, it's hard to get people excited about what could be in the future, right? Some people are very clear about the fact that just do what you said you'd do, and then we can discuss the rest. So I think that's important. I think this idea of stage-wise growth is important. You can't skip stages. I've seen that in many of my customers as well. People get excited about something, they want to do it, they kind of force this change upon the organization, and predictably, a year later, things fail because they have not made the necessary maturity steps along the way, and it's just painful to watch. And you're always biting your tongue and trying to not say "I told you so," but it's like these are hard-earned lessons, right? And people need to understand that. Now, when you talked about those 4 legs of the stool, you added the 4th leg of the stool in terms of data. When I think about the stuff that you've experienced for the last couple of decades in your career, what are the common themes vis-a-vis technology and data? Right, you talk to people, process, technology, and you added data. What are the common themes, and what can others learn from those experiences from you? What you've learned?
Good question. I think there's a lot of buzz at the moment around topics like AI, but it's brought something to the fore for me, I think, recently. AI is not the same thing as digitalization. It's not the same thing as servitization. And for me, the fundamental questions haven't really changed. I was invited to present a little while back over in Saudi Arabia for a very interesting event. And the basis of that was around smart transformation. And the gist of my presentation was saying that before you try and choose a tool, i.e. AI, for example, before you try and choose a tool and try and implement it, try and work out first what problem is you're trying to solve. What's your use case? What are you trying to achieve? And once you've done that, then work backwards and try and work out from that what tools you need to do that. I think AI is an amazingly powerful tool, but it may not be the thing you're trying to solve. First, define the problem you're trying to achieve or the problem you're trying to solve, and then work backwards for the tools afterwards.
I always had this phrase, work right to left. And I think that's what you're really saying, which is work right to left, figure out where you're trying to get to, figure out what use case you're trying to solve, for what problem you're trying to solve, then come back and figure out whether you need AI or you need spreadsheets. Well, I always tell many of our prospects, sometimes I listen to their stories and they might be at step 1 of the maturity curve that you referenced earlier, or they're a really small manufacturer with not that much install base. You know what, I hate to say this, but for your purposes, just stick to a little spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
over engineer stuff. You don't need to think about AI or predictive analytics or any of that stuff. Just do basic stuff, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
matching the technology to the needs is really important. And people kind of get a little bedazzled by all these happy talk and marketing language you hear about AI solving world hunger. But
Yeah.
I think do that. And I think the other part you mentioned, I think, is when you start looking at it from the use case perspective, how do you go about rolling this thing out? And I don't think it's a big bang theory that works well, does it? You need to kind of think about it in a different way, and your experiences support that, maybe.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think if you know already what you're trying to solve, then that conversation goes an awful lot easier. You already know what you're trying to solve, which means you've spoken with the people up front. They should already be on board and they see it as a solution to their problem. So that rollout should go a lot more easily when those people are on board and wanting it and trying to pull it into the organization to make it happen, rather than trying to do a top-down push or hammer in a square nail into a round hole, for example.
Well, I think the question for you is, there's a balance between patiently rolling it out versus impatiently looking for results, and I think that's where a lot of people get derailed. Is they impatiently start looking for results and then they start doing goofy stuff that derails everything. Right?
That's a very interesting point. Yes, you're right. I had an interesting series of conversations when we rolled out Salesforce a number of years ago, and we very deliberately did a bottom-up rollout. So we took in very careful feedback from all the various different sales offices around the globe, and we took great efforts to make sure we got as much what I call bottom-up feedback as we could. And Salesforce actually put us together with another organization who had done a top-down rollout. By that, I mean they did a centralized, standardized structure for the tool and then forced that through the business top-down. And it was really interesting comparing and contrasting what had gone well and badly for both organizations. So the positives that we'd seen largely spoken with their negatives and vice versa. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. We found that the buy-in and the usage of the tool was far, far better from our approach because we'd spent the time to make sure it matched what what our teams needed. But they had benefits in terms of data quality. So I think there's probably maybe a hybrid version, but I haven't got there yet.
Yeah, and I think what you said is correct. One size does not fit all. You got to tailor your approach to your organization, your maturity, and so on and so forth. We talked about when in the past when you and I have talked about these things, and you mentioned this in a different framework. You mentioned that you start with the use case and work your way back for technology. In the realm of services, your customer, your asset, is really at the heart of everything. How
Yeah.
do you kind of make sure that everything in the chain works correctly? How do you make sure that starting with the customer, starting with the asset, you're doing everything right so that the customer's happy and you get the benefits of the revenue growth and everything that comes with it? I mean, what's been your experience, or what can people learn from what you've done so far?
It's a really good question and a really tricky one to answer that. An individual service transaction is very easy to achieve and manage. So just one spare part shipment or just one field service activity, just having one of them is very easy to do. The challenge lies in managing and balancing thousands of them happening all at the same time and managing all the different conflicting priorities and resources and everything else. And I think that is the challenge to deal with. I liken it a little bit like trying to pilot a swarm of drones versus trying to pilot a large sort of jumbo jet across the Atlantic or something. Trying to fly those drones is a very, very different task to trying to fly the large plane. And if you see all of those drones when they're not coordinated, it can look like a total swarm of mosquitoes, cloud of mosquitoes. But if you can bring those into a way that they are all aligned and the processes are lining up and the people are working together and everything pulls together, then that's a really powerful thing to be able to achieve.
When I'm listening to you, the visual that comes to my mind is, we have this old Indian fable of six blind men and an elephant, right? Everybody's looking at this elephant differently, but everybody has to get coordinated to make sure they understand it's an elephant, right?
Yeah.
It's being able to align processes, mindsets, people, so that eventually the customer is just seeing one thing, right? Not these fragments of, not these drones or not mosquitoes, like you said. Now, there's one more thing that occurred to me when you were describing it that way, and what I've been saying this to people for the last maybe a couple of years, but a manufacturer's install base is probably one of the more complex ecosystems out there. And what I mean by that is, for you as a manufacturer, you're looking at a fleet that's maybe a couple of decades old with a variety of different technologies dating back from 20, 25 years ago to today. You're looking at a set of customers that are diverse and have different use cases. You're looking at a bunch of people in the field who are working for you who are trained at different tenures. And you're looking for at a bunch of, what do you call it, volume of transactions that your capital equipment people aren't used to. So going back to your point about aligning everything and making sure everything works, do people understand the complexity in this ecosystem?
I think service people do, yes. I think it's a bit of an unsung hero within organizations. Service is always, and you've said it yourself. I can't remember if I stole this phrase from you, but aftermarket, not afterthought. And aftermarket business or service business can be a bit of an afterthought and can be a bit of an unsung hero in there. But the complexity, I think, lies in managing all of those different changes and different flexibilities that are sort of hidden, inherent in them, as you rightly mentioned. And if you have the robust systems, you have the robust processes, the robust data behind it, all of that lot feeds together so that you can do things not once, but time and time again on a repeated basis and then scale it. And it's that's the challenge, I think, for service businesses.
I'm gonna ask you maybe a slightly controversial question, and it's controversial because just based on my I don't know 30 years of experience, I've always felt that organic volume growth almost becomes secondary to organic profit growth in manufacturers like the ones you and I've worked in. As a result of that, the the mindsets are all about cost and not about growth. Is that an accurate accurate observation? Because you also talk to lots of people, and more importantly, what is it going to take to change if I'm right? If I'm not right, I'm glad to see that, but that's my observation. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting observation. I'm just turning it around in my head as you're saying it. I think that comes about because it's easier to put together a cost-based business case, a savings-based business case. But the ones that are really interesting and grab the attention of your customer, of senior management, wherever, are the growth-based business cases, where you can do more sales out of it. And I think what you alluded to there was the top line growth versus the EBIT or cost based growth. And generally, aftermarket is always focused because the big budgets are fixed on the product side of the business, on the OEM side of the business. And after that, the maintenance, it's usually about saving money and reducing those cost-based business cases later. If you can switch that into a growth-based business case for your customer, then I think you can change those discussions, but it is not easy to do.
I've found it slightly difficult to have these conversations. And
Yeah.
when I go back to the mindset and the training, you know, because of what you said, because of the reactive nature, because of I need to make sure my customer is happy at a low cost, you almost never get the right, what I would call sales and marketing growth talent in the aftermarket world. At least that's one of the things I've realized. I'm gonna switch gears for a minute here. I want to go back to a couple of topics you mentioned. Right, you talked about AI getting all the press these days. How real is it within large manufacturers like the ones you've been at, or the people you talk to, or is it still one of those things? Yes, yes, let's the technology guys play with it, and we'll deal with it when it becomes real. Where are people in that life cycle, if you may?
It's definitely there. It's definitely real. I mean, there are sort of big bang projects. I've been working on one recently, as you know, we've been talking about it, which are going to have sort of fairly sort of influential changes to the business processes we're working in. But actually, in some areas, these things have been coming on for years. So I don't know, 2 decades ago, maybe even longer, the gas turbines have had rule-based monitoring systems to remotely monitor and track and monitor any issues on the machines. Those rule bases were forms of intelligence in a simple form. I think and those have slowly built and developed over the years, and that intelligence has slowly built and developed over the years. And the interesting thing there, which is I think where we'll get to, which we're not quite there yet, is taking the artificial intelligence piece and combining it with the technical knowledge and experience of our people and putting those two together. And I don't think we've quite got there. I think that's maybe the next stage that we're going to be looking for. But I think with the likes of ChatGPT, this has gone viral and it's it's now become sort of mainstream. But little bits and pieces of it have been around for years.
Now, when you think about what you just said, bits and pieces have been around for years. We've all cobbled together solutions, but the aftermarket and service business has traditionally been a laggard in terms of investing in technology. Do you have any advice for people as to how they should think about buying technology for people in your peer group, right? How can they succeed in setting the stage or setting the pace, if you may, in terms of investing in the right technology for the right results? That's kind of what part of my conversation with Mark Hessinger, our last guest, also was, and he had a very interesting take on it. What are your thoughts?
It's a challenge. Part of it depends on whether service is a standalone profit center or not within your business. If you are a standalone profit center, then you have a little bit more flexibility. Many service businesses are within the product business, and major technology investments are typically driven by the product business needs because they have the bigger budgets. I was fortunate when I rolled out Salesforce at Siemens, for example. We did it within service business. I took a very deliberate stance to build it bottom up, as I mentioned earlier, to suit the aftermarket business. The product business came on board with that tool a few years later. And what was interesting is after we'd rolled out our one, I'd been running with it for a couple of years, the version they developed later looked totally different. And I think this reflects the fundamental differences between the two business models. As I alluded to earlier about the swarm of drones and trying to manage all of those drones simultaneously, service is much more about delivering flexibility fast and reliably. And that needs you to be able to rapidly structure many options simultaneously in a robust manner that can deliver time after time after time. And having lots and lots of different transactions going through. So there needs to be a lot of flexibility and spare resources in the system to be able to achieve that. Whereas, and I'm sure the project business colleagues will shoot me for this, but the project businesses are more about managing large chunks of technology through the process from beginning to end as efficiently as possible. And efficiency typically means stripping out all of that excess, stripping out that flexibility and stripping out those excess resources. And with that often goes the flexibility needed by the service business. So it's going back to the same thing I was talking about before, the swarm of drones and trying to pilot a swarm of drones versus trying to pilot a large aircraft. They're both very, very demanding skill sets, but they're very different. And I think that tends to show in the ways the different systems need to be built up.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating, and I think you're right. It's. I will just digress for about 30 seconds. When I started Entitled, it was built around trying to figure out what's the customer doing, what to do about it, and how was to make recommendations happen, and so on and so forth. And we built a very rudimentary rudimentary opportunity tracking, CRM-like functionality just to make it easy for people.
Mm-hmm.
We're finding out now, a few years after we built this application, people want us to build that out even more because, to your point, they like some of the flexibility and other things we built into it compared to the traditional CRM. And so I'm suddenly getting pushed into building out more of this CRM functionality for aftermarket parts and service people because their needs are different from the capital equipment people.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Anyway,
Interesting.
coming back to this thing about technology. So, one last question for you as you wrap up this thing. Does technology and being an aftermarket champion go hand in hand, or is that a wishful thinking on my part?
Um, I think the problem is not technology or the number of vendors that are out there. That there's so many options out there. I think that you can find something very easily. The challenge there is that you can get lost very easily if you haven't picked your starting point as being, as what I was talking about before, as being the solution to a customer problem or a meaningful customer challenge. You need to start there, your right to left. Start at the right, frame what you're trying to solve, and then work back. And whatever tools you need to solve that may be a technology-based tool, may not be. To your point about Excel earlier, maybe a lo-fi Excel solution is the one you need to solve the problem you have on the table today. Maybe it's an AI tool, we don't know. But going through those steps that way round, I think, and having done that in various different ways, I think building up from simple enables you to make it complicated later. If you try complicated at the beginning, you'll get in a mess. And I think the sort of the top tier service providers out there do that, and they look at the solution and the processes and make sure the business processes to get to that solution are as clear and simple and well designed as possible.
It's actually, I'm glad you said what you did because without the clear business objectives and what you're trying to go, where you're trying to go to, none of this stuff matters. So, I think the implicit advice you said is that be clear about the objectives, be clear about what you're trying to do and improve, and then work your way from the rest, work your way back from there. As we wrap this thing up, Roger, what are your, based on the wonderful experiences you've had, what are your maybe one or two pieces of advice for your peer group in terms of being able to make their organizations aftermarket champions?
I think it's about balance and trying to bring clarity through the chaos. And service is chaotic, and there's constantly changing customer demands and shifts in timelines, shifts in requirements. But it's about trying to understand which problems are coming up repeatedly, and trying to look at the bigger picture, about trying to steer large groups of problems and look at the foundation of it and build it up in stages. You can't try and boil the ocean in one go, but build it up in stages. Back to the 1% I was talking about before. If you can do 1% better every day and pull things together slowly, that I think will have a much bigger effect over the time. But do that in a way which is what I call North Star driven. So you have a bigger picture, that you know what you're heading for, and then aim towards that step by step.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask you the last question that I always ask my guests. Right? In the spectrum of luck to superb skills and attributes that you may have yourself, where do you think your success has relied on? I mean, how much of it is luck versus how much of it is just Roger Durham being an amazing person?
I'm a great believer in making your own luck. I believe if you work hard for 99, I'll go back with the 1% again. If you work hard for 99% of the time and have everything in place ready so that 1% of blind luck or opportunity does come up, that you're in an opportunity or a position to be able to do something with that. That 1%, I guess you could call luck, but the 99% having something in place to do with that, I think that's where you can play a role in that. There was a pro golfer called Gary Player who was credited for saying, the harder I practice, the luckier I get. And
Yeah, that's a brilliant thing, and I think Louis Pasteur also said something like luck,
absolutely.
something about prepared mind and luck. Yes.
Yes.
Good. Well, I think this is a fascinating conversation. If anything I've taken away from this, Roger, it's 1%. It's now indelibly tattooed in my brain, which I think is really a great concept, and it really makes sense. And the beautiful part about the 1% is that the aftermarket and services business have this amazing opportunity to practice at 1% because they're the ones who have this relationship that gives them the 1% opportunities every single day. And that's a great philosophical approach to take. And if anything, our listeners take from this conversation, it really this 1% to me is really a fabulous piece of advice. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Roger,
Thank
this
you
has been
very
a great
much.
chat with you. Thank you for being our guest today. And I'm expecting that our listeners will be equally excited about listening to this story as much as I was today. So thank you for that, and happy holidays, Roger.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity, and happy holidays to you too.
Okay. As we complete another enlightening episode, I extend my sincere gratitude to our esteemed guests and you, our valued listeners. If today's conversation resonated with you, please subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Play, or simply visit our website at www.entitled.com for more enriching content. Remember, the pursuit of aftermarket excellence is an ongoing journey, and I look forward to continuing with you. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and continue championing aftermarket success.